want to introduce my good friend, Battinto Batts, Dean of the Cronkite School at ASU, to just talk about why ASU is actually here in Southern California, what does journalism mean to the Ten Across Project, and why the conversation we're about to have with our friends from Annenberg is so important. So with that, Dean Batts.
Thank you, Duke. So when we were introducing everyone this morning and going through the introductions, I was purposeful in pointing out that ever since I came to ASU 2.5 years ago, that we've been seeking a partnership and collaboration with Ten Across. That has been a strategic partnership and a strategic opportunity for us for a number of reasons, beyond the fact that I really like Duke and that he was the architect for our building in downtown Phoenix, but that this Ten Across project really represents an important laboratory both for learning and for also connecting with communities and advancing the cause of journalism at this very, very important time. I will say to you that we had a lot of great discussions thus far today about the key issues that we're facing on the corridor. But one key issue that we really haven't discussed yet that I would say is fundamental to everything is how are we going to marshal the efforts of communities to get them involved, to get them to see the problems that we're facing, to get them involved in terms of solutions, to get them to buy into this and to understand that not only are we in the midst of a crisis and we have some very real things that we have to confront, but that there are opportunities for them to make a difference and for people not to be apathetic or feel as though all hope is lost and that there's no role for them in this process. So as I said, I really like the opportunity for what Ten Across represents for a lot of reasons. In addition to the fact that it contains some of the key issues facing our society, if you also look at the states that it involves, it also involves a lot of political division. And if you think about that political division that we are confronting in our country, that is going to be a barrier to solutions. We have to find a way to get through those political divisions and to get people to coalesce around basic facts about the problems that we're confronting in our communities. If we don't do that, really we're all wasting our time here. Okay, we can have summits, and summits are nice. We can do research. Research is important. But if we don't get people to buy into the importance of what we're researching and our findings and what we're talking about here, if they can't find a way to be a part of that, then we're lost. And that's where journalism, that's where communications comes in. We have to find ways to build better relationships with communities. We have to find ways to not just talk to people, but to engage in two-way conversations with them. And that's what I will offer has been a failing on the part of journalism and communications. We've done a great job of telling people what's wrong, but not really telling them how they can get involved. We've done a great job of being the gatekeeper in terms of what is news and what's important, but not done a really great job of hearing from people in terms of what's important to them and what they expect from their communities and their leaders. I go back to a very basic principle. Our founders of our country, they had a lot of flaws, but I respect the fact that they took the time that when they were crafting the Constitution, that they put the freedom of press into the Constitution to provide a means of checks and balances on power. Journalism is fundamental to a functioning democracy. We have to stand up and meet the challenge of our times and to play our role in connecting with communities, holding power to account, helping communities become engaged in the democratic process to help to lead us forward. That is why, again, I'm excited about 10 Across and what it represents. That is why in any opportunity that I have to speak with a funder, to speak to someone who may be able to bring resources to bear to help to make this possible, I'm always pitching 10 Across in some shape or form to make that happen. We're looking for partners, people who see this opportunity, see the potential here in the same way. I see this as not only a way to address the key issues for our country that we've laid out in terms of climate change, water scarcity, and other issues that are very, very important, but also how do we evolve journalism to face the key issues of our democracy. This is an opportunity that 10 Across provides, and provides a model. If we can be successful here, then we can replicate that elsewhere. I want to create something that will be a model for other journalism schools or other journalism entities to say, hey, they're doing something there in terms of getting communities involved in the decision-making process and helping to move this forward. And that other people will want to replicate that, come and be a part of it, and that there's something that can be learned from it. I think it is a fantastic laboratory for change. And that's what inspires me, and that's why I get very, very fired up about it. So I'm looking forward to the discussion this afternoon about climate communications. Again, we've done a great job of telling people what's wrong, but how do we get people involved in solving the problem, okay? Lastly, what I will say is that journalism, communications, and media cuts across all disciplines. All disciplines. We can do great research, but if people don't know about it, it's just great research. How can we put it into action? How can we inspire people? How can we get them involved? How can we move forward together? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dean Batts. I'm inspired. I don't know about you. I'm ready to get out there, tell those stories. Last year, when we had our summit, we talked a lot about communication being a real challenge for all of us. And how do we start to get our arms around being able to tell the stories that need to be told to the different audiences? So not just the public, but our mayors, our city councils, how do we make the case? And so we took that to heart, and that's why we're having this workshop this afternoon and bringing some really inspiring leaders in this space to talk about creative ways to do this. I'm going to advance here real quick. Hopefully I'm clicking the right button. I'm going to go past that. So one of those experts who I got to know over how many Zoom calls? I don't know, Allison, 5 maybe? 5 or 6, and we found out that we both have a creative arts background. We have all these things in common, so it was really wonderful getting to know her. But she is amazingly inspiring, and she has done a lot of important work around climate communication in journalism. And so without further ado, I'm going to let her give a little more on her background, but she is the director for the Center of Climate Journalism and Communications, which is really important in this space. We find that there's a lot of journalists out there that are still trying to get their arms around how to do this, and it's so important. So she's going to walk through some tips for you in terms of how you can use this in your own work. So without further ado, Allison.
Hey, everybody. Good to see you. Just building off what Ray said, I am the inaugural director at the Center for Climate Journalism and Communication at USC Annenberg, and I also have a second job at Annenberg in which I am the first curator in the school's Institute for Environment and Sustainability. So I have a background as a journalist. I started my career at CNN, and I have also spent many years working in a museum context curating contemporary art projects. So I came to this work really out of an interest in how climate change is visualized. That was the beginning, and it's just sort of like grown from there. I had one of those experiences where I heard a lecture years ago, and the person who gave the lecture is now the head of the energy ministry in Iceland, and she started by saying, "What comes to mind when you think of the Arctic?" And 100% of the people in the audience said polar bears or icebergs, and it seemed almost like unjust, and it riled me up to such a degree that, well, that's what I focused my graduate degree on, and that's what I focus all of my time on now. So without further ado, I'm going to share some tips with you. They're not like Allison's favorite personal tips. These are all, there's lots of research, backing up each and every one of these things that I'm going to say, and there's so much research out there that, as you know, you might even be able to find something contrary to what I'm saying. These are best practices undergirded by research and the ones that I think work best. What I will talk you through, I hope when you're done, you'll be like, oh, I can absolutely use that today. That is my goal. This one's for you, Casey Calloway. Do you know Casey Calloway, most people here? She is a Chief Resilience Officer in Mobile, Alabama, and we were just laughing about how I met her. Because of my background as a journalist, I will cold call anyone, and I do mean absolutely anyone. And so I decided I wanted to know more about this field that's not really maybe emerging anymore of Chief Resilience Officers. So I had a research assistant make a spreadsheet with all the Chief Resilience Officers I could find in the United States, and I just started cold calling it one by one. And Casey really stood out of the people who were willing to answer the phone because of her incredible ability to speak to her community. So Casey should speak for herself. You should track her down afterwards and talk to her about this if you haven't before. Oh my gosh, Ellie, her goddaughter, is like, Casey, that lady's talking about you. But you should talk to her about this because Casey has the knowledge about climate change, but she doesn't beat you over the head when talking about climate change because that's not appropriate in Mobile, Alabama. What I might be able to say in my community in Los Angeles might be very different from what you are able to say in your community. And you will meet scientists, you'll meet other people that do things similar to what I do who will say climate change. I don't think you have to. And I know that can be, for some people, a kind of scandalous position, but you have to think about who your audience is. Different audiences are prepared for different things. You might talk to some of your constituents one way and some of them another. Think about it. You do this all day long. We all had Thanksgiving, right? Maybe the aunt or uncle that you sat next to, you explained your job differently than you do to somebody at a meeting like this. That's all I'm saying. I start all of my work from this baseline. Climate change is real. It's happening now, and we caused it, period. But how I get to that is a little bit different depending on the situation. So Michael, research assistant who's here today, when he and I talk about climate change, I can say anything. But when I go home to the community I grew up in, it's a very different story. I grew up in a community of about 50 people, so rural that my mom just made up an address when she moved out there because there weren't any addresses. And now the rest of the addresses are built off of my parents' address. Very rural, very conservative, and what I do for a living does not fly. The fact that I even work at a university is very off-putting to some people, but I'm 45 years old. I've been out there my whole life, so there's enough trust that people will still be my friend, even though, I work at a private university in Los Angeles. But here's what I do when I go home. I ask the neighbors, how's hunting season? That's interesting. Were the deer in that same place last year? Was it related to water, do you think? Have you been seeing this happen year over year? That's interesting. Well, how's your kids doing? That's one example. You know your own community, and don't let anybody else tell you that you don't know your community. You know what your community needs. I don't know what your community needs. I can't tell you how to talk to your community about climate change. But I believe that if you're invested in your community, and because of the kind of work you do, I believe you know. When I'm talking about climate change in Los Angeles, I'm going to talk about LA issues, right? Like, I'm not going to talk about the Arctic, which is a personal obsession. I'm obsessed with the Arctic. I'm obsessed. I mean, this is an area where incredible geopolitical activity is happening. It's in the United States, the place where we are closest to Russia. As permafrost thaws, there are going to be things in our air that are going to be very dangerous to breathe. I could go on and on. But when I'm in Los Angeles and I'm talking to an audience in Los Angeles, I'm not going to talk about the Arctic. It doesn't matter that that's like my passion and I've written papers on it and I'll, talk your ear off about it afterwards. I don't talk about that because that's not what means something to my community. My community in LA is really concerned about drought, for example. We are really concerned about environmental justice. We have oil wells that are, pumping next to people's homes here. So that's what I talk to my community about. That's what I talk about in LA. I told you what I talk about in Descanso, where I grew up, and what you talk to your community about will be a little bit different. And I think this is one of the hard things about climate change is what I observe people want is just, tell me 3 things to do. This is so complicated. Tell me I should say this, this, and this, and do this, this, and that, right? People want that with solutions too. They want us to say, stop doing X, start doing Y, and then after that do Z. But you know what? It's not that simple. It's just not. And I think instead of begrudging that it's not necessarily that simple, we make peace with it. We do some of the homework about what means a lot to our communities, and then we respond to them. So for a long time, we talked about climate change as a distant threat. I think even this, I love being amongst my people because I know I can use this terminology with you. I think 1.5 degrees, I think 2030, like all of those things seemed pretty far away. Now they're quite close. And even forget about 1.5, we know now that this is the hottest summer on record. I personally think, and many of my colleagues who do work similar to mine agree, that this summer, I get chills when I say this to you right now. I think something changed this summer with the public. Because an issue that was abstract, is now very tangible. I know you felt it in Arizona. I mean, I think this is the first time I've worn pants all year. It's been hot. It's been really, really hot. So I encourage you, when you're talking about climate change, to talk about what's happening now. I'm not saying don't talk about the future. Of course, I would not say that. I'm just saying tell the story of now. Make sure people know that this isn't a thing that's coming down the pike, but it's happening at this moment. I chose these headlines because I like them, because they're good, in my opinion. They don't speak to something that's going to get you or your grandchildren, at the end of the century. We've talked about this a little bit to some degree, but I think what can happen in climate change storytelling, and this might be applicable to some of you more than others, is we let brilliant scientists tell the story. We might even see on the news somebody who's not from our city talking about what's happening in our city. I would encourage you all to recalibrate your idea of what expertise is. All of you are experts, of course, or you wouldn't be here, but also people who've been living in communities for a long time are experts. They see the impacts and they know things in different ways, and those ways matter too. So when we're telling stories about our communities, we must always include the voices of those communities. And, Dean Batts and I were just talking, and he's telling me about his daughter. I won't mention where she goes to school. But I said, have her come talk to me. Let's talk about communicating about climate change. And he said she's very into social justice. And I said, perfect. Climate change is a social justice issue. Black people, brown people, and women are the groups most impacted by climate change. So think about that in your climate communications also. Okay, but this one's really for you, Dean Batts. Because for so long, when we heard reporting about climate change, or even when we talked to each other about climate change, it was doom and gloom. Just the world's on fire, we're all going to die. I still see a lot of that reporting, and I keep track of it, and I sometimes roll my eyes, and I sometimes stomp my feet. Really makes me mad, because maybe you meet people who feel this sense of ennui about all of this, like, what can I do anyway? Well, this kind of reporting, this kind of communication that you all are doing in your jobs can make a really big difference. There is indeed opportunity. There is opportunity here. And I have a feeling, I have a strong suspicion based on what I know about who this group is composed of, that you are part of those solutions. So I would like you to think about the next time you're having a conversation about climate change, something you can do is also talk about what's working great. I will tell you something. I was just meeting some friends of Casey's, Abena, am I saying that right? From Tallahassee, and I met somebody who's running for lieutenant mayor of Sausalito. There she is. And I just felt so fired up because I was surrounded by all of these women who are doing such fascinating work, who really know their stuff. And I was like, oh my God, this is exhilarating. Like, maybe we can do this, and we probably all have moments like that. I think my secret suspicion is that, especially in groups like this, it's not popular to talk about solutions because, or positivity, because it might mean that you're not serious about it. Well, I'm serious about it. It scares me to death sometimes, but also I see glimmers of hope. So let us all please find a way to talk about those glimmers of hope still. This seems so obvious, but it happens all the time. Oh, you know what I thought I did? I thought I took out that PBS logo, but I forgot. I try when I give these presentations to only leave up the logos of the ones who I really like. So I'm sorry, PBS, keep doing great work, but this headline, no bueno. Do not talk about the IPCC warning of anything. What in the hell's the IPCC? Even if you say what the IPCC is, IPCC, people don't know. Intergovernmental Panel on. So that's the other thing I say to people is, like, if you're going to talk about the IPCC, or right after this, my bags are stored downstairs, I'm going to COP to give some talks. So I said to my parents a few weeks ago, I said, I'm going to Dubai to give some talks at COP. And my mom pulled me aside later and she said, I didn't know that you were working with the police now. And it was a really good lesson for me because, in my colleagues who I work most closely with, like Michael, I know I can say COP and he gets it. I forget that my parents might not know what COP is, and it's not enough to necessarily spell out what those words are. Like, what is that? Well, it's actually the UN annual conference on climate change. They have high-level negotiators for all the countries come together and they, try to work out a deal to get us on a healthy path to the future. So when I say jargon, I'm talking about things like IPCC. I'm also talking about whatever. Please, each of you, imagine what are the words that you use in your field that are polysyllabic, that don't make sense to the rest of us. Like, what might you use that I might not understand? One of my colleagues, Wendy Brun de Brun, who studies language and climate change, says, once you get past 3 syllables, people don't know what's going on. And she actually had some really interesting feedback about mitigation and adaptation that I'll share with you too. In her research, she said that when surveyed, most people didn't know what mitigation is, and they thought adaptation was turning a book into a movie. Okay, so we take for granted at this point, we all think everybody knows what mitigation and adaptation is, but they don't. So similar to explaining what IPCC is, I recommend you think about these words that you use so often that you don't even know anymore, that for, other people outside of these circles, they might not know what they mean. They might take a little bit more explaining, as an exercise for fun, because I know this sounds like so much fun. Go through something you recently wrote, report something for work, and I'll bet you find some of those words. And then think about who that report went to. Hopefully it went to people who understand those words. But what if it goes to the public? And then what if they're like, I don't get it, and this doesn't matter to me? And as we were talking about earlier, we have other concerns like getting food on the table, paying for our rent. So like we have to keep the barrier to entry of this conversation very low, because it's a privilege that I get to stand up here and do this work. I can worry about climate change because I am not worried about rent. I'm not worried about putting food on the table. Make it easy for people to participate in this conversation. Now you knew I was going to go here, because I mentioned to you earlier how I got into this work. But I think that images are a really, really big deal because, in part, we haven't thought about them a lot. So we're not always doing the best job we can. You all know about the Willow Pipeline project in Alaska. It was on the front page of the New York Times just this spring, I'd say about March. Front page of the New York Times, and there's a picture of a polar bear and her cubs. I didn't like it. I did not like it at all, because Alaska is about more than the polar bear and her cubs. Also, I don't think that this image has resonance any longer. It's a stand-in for climate change, and any opportunity you have for your message, any space you have in a newspaper, a press release, on your website, think about that is precious real estate. How can you use that to the greatest effect? There's a great website I'll mention to you all now. It's called climatevisuals.org. I use it all the time. I've used it on my website at Annenberg, and actually I used it for this presentation. One of the previous slides, and maybe another one coming up. I love climatevisuals.org because their pictures follow research-based best practices for what works when communicating about climate change. There are some wonderful, wonderful images in there. And they may or may not work for you. I've encouraged the Climate Visuals folks who are based in the UK to give us some more images that look like the United States so that we can use them a little bit more. But I think even just looking at that will give you a sense. Most of these images have people in them, regular people, people of color. I'm thinking of an image right now that I love on Climate Visuals that's a child who uses a wheelchair. Check out that resource, and don't discount this just because it's the thing that nobody is going to dissect. Think about what the opportunities are to feature what is going on in your community versus some like stand-in image that's frankly people are going to gloss over. This one's really tough. This one, to some degree, revolves around being a total maniac like me who basically just for fun, 24 hours a day, hyped up on caffeine, reading about climate. It's hard to be super tapped in all the time to this language stuff, but I'm thinking about it a lot, and I bet you are thinking about it a lot too. So nature has been exploited by us in many ways, but so too has the word nature. Everything sounds fine and dandy when it comes from nature. And I use this example of natural gas. And I use this Newsweek headline because I love it. Methane gas crisis. If you're talking about methane gas, talk about methane gas. Natural gas is giving a pass to natural gas producers. If we can be more specific about language with this sort of thing, I think it'll go a long way. Most people who I talk to about natural gas who are like with the program people, but not climate people, they don't know. Here's another example, and this might be more relatable to your work, but it's trickier, even trickier than this, is natural disasters. I have a colleague, Santina Contreras in the Public Policy School, who studies responses to natural disasters. And what's important to know is that a natural disaster, as we may call it, might be exacerbated by climate change. Is it still a natural disaster then? There are plenty of attribution resources out there now. If you go to my center's website, do you know what the website is, Michael? It's like uscclimate.edu or something. USC Climate Communications, you'll find it. We have a page of just tons of resources. It's like you click it, it says resources. And there are tons of guides for communicating about climate change, for attribution, I don't know, anything under the sun, what's going on with ESG, what's the latest in this, that, the other. There's a lot of stuff there. But one thing that's definitely there is attribution resources, but hopefully you won't have to use those attribution resources yourself. Maybe there's somebody else in your department. Maybe you can pull a recent news source from a credible organization that cites the attribution so that you can say, there was, oh, you know another one, wildfire. Food for thought. So natural disasters, maybe instead of saying, we had this terrible natural disaster, maybe we again get more specific and say, we had some extreme flooding caused by the storm this weekend, and it was exacerbated by climate change. And depending on how far you can go and how far you want to go, climate change, which is caused by the burning of fossil fuels. Okay, it's like a lot, I know. But also, I hope when you heard me talk about this, I have to believe that on some level this feels instinctual to you. I believe that everything I just said you knew already, but like maybe somebody just needed to say it to you in like a 9 easy tips sort of a fashion. I believe that you know exactly how to do this. And I believe if you say something that wasn't just right, that's okay. Again and again, I read papers saying that what we really have to do is talk more about climate change. Do I think that communicating about climate change will solve our problems? No, but I think it's like a really important part of all of this. What we do when we communicate about climate change is we normalize this conversation. Maybe one day Casey is going to be able to say to her community, instead of like, let's work on infrastructure, and I want to be sure if there's flooding that, that your business is protected. Maybe one day, if we keep doing this, she'll be able to talk about climate change. Maybe I can talk about climate change with my childhood neighbors growing up. So I find, I also just want to say from my personal experience that like, I talk about climate change a lot. I'm talking about it 4 times this week on a stage. And my language is still changing. And sometimes I find that I get things wrong. I probably updated these slides before I sent them to Ray because things are changing fast. I always love learning more. And if somebody will come up here afterwards and tell me something that I'm wrong about here, I'm going to be super grateful because I want to do better and I want to normalize talking about climate change. Because here's something that I've noticed that is really frightening to me in my work. So I spend a lot of my time working with journalists. They are almost always general assignment reporters or editors. Sometimes they work on beats that have nothing to do with climate, and I'm training them whether they're at ABC or Associated Press or a really small outlet in Colorado. I'm trying to give them the resources they need to just get out there and do it. So another part of my job, something I started doing that's a whole lot of fun, is I started providing training to our faculty who does research on climate change at the university. And that's been a lot of fun for me because I get to hear like the most cutting edge things going on. And as a result, I've started a new series called Research to Reality, where as soon as new research about climate change comes out, I can just like forget, like if there's not an embargo on the journal article, I email a bunch of journalists, get them on a call, and tell them right away what the new thing is and how we should be doing the thing. So these are 2 very different groups that I work closely with, the scientists and the journalists. And I have observed anecdotally over time that the reason that journalists aren't communicating about climate change turns out to be the exact same reason that the scientists aren't communicating about climate change, and that is because of a lack of confidence. Actually, this is more than anecdotal because I'm a survey fiend. I'll survey anybody about anything. And in fact, I should plug our survey. Okay. Wait till you hear what I'm working on now. Okay, so I'm getting sidetracked. Life with Allison. Okay, so we are working on a first-of-its-kind survey to get the perspective of journalists, scientists, and others who communicate about climate change, what the key issues are in the field, and kind of like what can we do about them, and then we'll like publish that on our website and make it available to everybody so that we can just like get a sense of what the key issues are that you're facing, what you're doing that's working, who do you trust, who do you as people who really know trust as climate communicators. Confidence, surveying about confidence. So scientists and journalists aren't communicating about climate for the same reason. They do not have confidence to do it. Everybody is really afraid in this environment for different reasons. I think people are afraid of messing up in public. The last thing a journalist wants is to get an email saying, you conveyed that fact about water droplets incorrectly. That's not how this process works, and that's not why it's going wrong, or whatever. And in fact, these journalists are getting harassed mercilessly for reporting on climate to begin with. One of my recent graduates tells me stories that horrify me, and I feel I need to work on preparing my students for this, for what happens when you go out into the world and people don't want to hear what you have to say about climate. So they're getting feedback even if what they're saying is right. And if what you're not saying is right, you're going to get it too. Scientists, different. They've been trained to do research. They feel like they're not really prepared to communicate about climate change. So I have different curricula, as you can imagine, for scientists as for journalists. But like the big secret is that I'm not sure how much it matters exactly what I'm saying to them. I think in some way I'm giving them a feather as to Dumbo. They now believe they can do it, and that is the difference. They now feel like they have a couple of things they can draw on so they can do it, and that means a lot. So you all, I mean, you really know your stuff. You can do this. I hope you'll do it. Maybe consider some of these points when you're inside of your job so that you can communicate more effectively about climate there. And I also hope that you'll think about what of this you can take away. I want you to think about how you could maybe use some of these things when you're on your way back home in an Uber and you're talking to the driver about what you do. That's another tip. That's a really good place to practice your climate shtick. Talk to the Uber driver about it and talk to people who you don't know, who have no reason to agree with you. Like you don't have a social contract with them really of any kind. And ask them what they think. I always learn a lot when I talk to people about climate, including you here today. So I'm really grateful to have this opportunity. I'm also I'm giving a talk about communicating specifically about water in Dubai later this week. So if you need any water communications resources, poor Michael. Michael has those too, because he researched them for me, put them in a doc. So we can share some of those things along the way. I really want to thank Duke and I want to thank Ray for including me today. It's such a pleasure to be here, and best of luck in your future climate communications.
Thanks, Allison. Dave Hondula from the City of Phoenix in our Office of Heat Response and Mitigation.
You're like a celebrity CRO.
I think I need some training from you, but
No,
thank you.
You've got it because you're in the paper all the time.
I apologize to others for taking space. I was glad you mentioned the general journalists who are on assignment to cover the climate stories, and you mentioned that many of them work on beats that don't often include climate, and some of the stories that you've seen me in apparently and others are from these general assignment reporters. And you talked about the scientists and the journalists, but there are also the scientist journalists trained in atmospheric science, the broadcast meteorologists. I know in Phoenix, when we have the inevitable barrage of stories every summer, it's hot, it's bad, and I'm out here with this sensor to tell you it's bad from the general journalists. The broadcast meteorologists get furious. Why aren't they involved in this conversation? So how can we work to integrate them into this dialogue? And do they even have a place in this dialogue?
That is such a good question. Are you talking about the meteorologists or the general assignment reporters?
I think the broadcast meteorologists feel like they should be involved in telling the stories that are currently assigned to the general assignment reporters.
Yeah, I mean, that's, as a person who's worked in a newsroom before, like the newsroom hierarchies, who gets to be the boss of what, that's difficult. But here's some encouraging news. Is there are some incredible organizations out there that focus specifically on training meteorologists how to incorporate climate into their storytelling. And in fact, the American Meteorological Association says, like, you are obligated to do this now. Like, you must. Here's what my tip would be if you are dealing with a general assignment reporter who you feel like might not get it, is to say to them, I'm happy to talk to you. Before we get on the phone, I want to send you a couple of things that might help as background for our conversation. And that could even be an article that you liked the framing of. I did this morning with a journalist who spoke to me about layoffs recently in the climate space in media, and his take on it was, I wasn't sure if he had all the information. So today I responded to him and said, hey, it was so great talking to you the other day. I just saw this story about, I know you're planning on reporting on the closure of the climate desk at CBS. Just thought you might want to see this story. Looks like they're hiring some more people back. I do that all the time. And I think that reporters love it because you're doing their homework for them, I think it's very appropriate for you to send a press release in advance, or to send a link to your website or somebody else's website who you like, who said it right. And when you talk to that person, to be very explicit and say exactly how you want to frame it and why you are framing it that way, because that, like, the why is sometimes also missing. And I think most reporters want to do a really good job, but they might not have the science background. So if you're saying this is a deadly heat and they don't report on why it's a deadly heat, I would recommend, this is a deadly heat. We know that once it, temperature surpasses XXX, we get YYY consequences as much as possible. But I don't really think you need any help. Like, I think you got this covered. You are really good at this. Your city's lucky to have you. Yes, sir.
First off, you've reconfirmed two things, and I really appreciate how you've done this. Words matter. They really do. And in the context that we're talking about, this is we're in the cone of silence inside this room, right?
Cone of silence.
I never mentioned climate change. My friends to the left think I'm not going far enough. My friends to the right think I work for George Soros.
But you work for your community, and that's why you don't do it.
Hold on. So stay.
I'm very passionate. I'm real sorry.
No, I'm like you. But most of the reporters and most of the journalists that I'm talking with are on the business team and the economic team, who are trying to sort out all of this from what it really ultimately means. One, from what does ESG really mean, and how does that going to get measured, to what are the economic consequences of doing nothing. So I'm curious, in your work, I also find that sometimes, I'm not a CRO, we work with and support these, but is it sometimes better to communicate with a reporter as if you're not really seeking for them to be your PR machine, but to really, like you said, go on background, give them the information, give them whatever data it is, they'll sort through it. Am I making sense? Is that?
This is spot on. Do you all understand that phrase, I'll talk to you on background? Okay, that means a reporter calls you and says, I want to interview you about drought in your state. You say, if you don't want to talk to them, but you want them to have information, I'm pleased to speak with you on background. You're going to say that in writing in an email, and then you're going to say it again when you begin the conversation. And what this means is that you're sharing with the reporter, this could be good for you, you're probably doing this too, you're sharing with the reporter the information that they might need to have, but your name's not going to be attached to it. So when you speak on background, you can say things that you might not have said otherwise. Now, would I advise you to just go talking to any old person on background? No, I almost never talk on background under any circumstances. I just don't. I don't really need to. What I'm doing in the world is not like, nobody's asking me, what the president's senior advisor on climate change thinks about something and I'm whispering in their ear. Like, that's not happening to me. So be careful. If you have a relationship with a reporter, and you must have serious relationships by now, for example, you know who you can trust and who you can't. And you could get burned, but there are times when talking on background will do you a lot of favors. And you know when else talking on background can be helpful? When you want to give somebody else information and you are ready to pass the mic. Because we have to also develop a new generation of climate storytellers, a diverse group of climate storytellers. So we might say, here's what's going on, and who you should talk to? You should talk to my colleague so-and-so, or who's been doing great work about this. That's a great way to handle it, and I'm so glad that you brought up that background point. It can be really useful. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. First of all, I am Marianne Janelle.
She's running for lieutenant mayor of Sausalito, so FYI. Oh my God, I can't keep up. I'm sorry. She does so much. She's bossing us around in California.
No, I want your feedback. Your help. So here's my question. So you have a journalist background, and I'm assuming that most of the time you are helping people understand the issue. What type of language can you deploy when you want people to take action on an issue? So we're trying to be informative, but we also want them to do something.
People are, let me tell you what my opinion is that people are desperate to be told what to do. People just want me, speaking to boss around, people just want me to boss them around all day. They are so eager for me to boss them with words. They want me to say this, don't say that, you're done, and then they can walk out the door. People are desperate for concrete solutions. So what people want to hear is not, they don't want to hear, well, you're going to have flooding, and your business is in danger. What they want to hear is we recommend that each business buy 10 sandbags. They're available right now at Lowe's and Home Depot. People want concrete solutions that they can manage. Like, climate change is such a massive issue. It's so overwhelming for so many people. So the more concrete we can get with things that people understand, the better off we're going to be. And I know that that's impossible in your situation sometimes because it's not go buy 10 sandbags, but people want to be deployed by you to do the right thing. I really believe that. I think it's one of our greatest issues, and it's something that I've observed just because I talk about this a lot. And after almost every talk I give, 3 people come up to me and they always ask the same question. So what do I do? In case you want to know what my response is. Vote. Vote for people who are going to prioritize climate. Think ahead about what's coming in 2024. Think about the success of the Inflation Reduction Act and other legislation. Imagine what you want for the future, and then vote. And the other thing I always say is what I just told you. Communicate about this, talk about this. I feel empowered, mess it up a little bit and then get back on the horse and do it again, Any other questions? Hi, yes.
Hi, Allison. Anthony Brower. I work at Gettysburg. I'm also a partner. I teach passive design solutions at the USC School of Architecture.
Same dean. You got a new dean yesterday. You got a new dean. Congratulations.
Someone from UCLA was
Oh, yeah?
So thank you very much for coming. I love the idea of concrete solutions. How can we best talk to journalists? Because I do a lot of writing. I get journalists calling all the time. If it's not sensational, they sometimes don't want to hear it. And the concrete solutions sometimes aren't sexy enough for them, but that's what people need to do. So how do you pivot those conversations?
Okay, well, first thing, because you work at USC, you can participate in one of my training programs as a faculty member, because I don't just work with scientists, I work with psychologists, landscape architects, I work with people just like you, and I force you to spend a day with me in our exquisite studio at Annenberg, and I'm gonna sit you down behind the news desk, and I'm gonna ask you inane questions that are going to make you bananas, but they're the kinds of questions that you're going to get. They're really reductive. We'll go over it again and again until the words feel right, the length is right, the tempo, all of that, and I can help you with that. You know what? You're probably not going to get calls about that thing that's not super sexy. There's a good chance you're not going to. But what I would recommend is to look out for what we call in the business news pegs. A news peg is, let's see, I'm trying to think of a good example of a news peg for right now. Okay, you have made a set of I'm going to say Christmas lights that use far more energy than Christmas lights have ever used. Don't be pitching that story in January. Don't pitch it in July. You know what I'm saying? Look for the thing about your thing and then find a way to make it relate to what's happening right now. This is a version of Know Your Audience. So if you want to talk about drought, don't talk about it during a rainstorm. You know, that's an easy way to conceptualize it, but I find that when it comes to climate, there is a hunger for these stories. People are looking for new ways to tell a story that's frankly kind of difficult to tell. And this is a great point about the business writers. They are in such a difficult position right now. Imagine your job is to sort through what's greenwashing and what's not for a living. That is tough. Those people also, you can be a resource to. You know, once you meet, you know, the LA Times architecture writer, whoever it is, who is it? Carolina Miranda? Maybe? Yeah, I think. Once you meet her, become her resource so that when she has questions on, say, architecture, she's going to call you. And you're going to chit chat, and you might talk to her on background. And then next time she's going to take your email when you want to talk about this little particular angle. That really works. It's, you know, so much of it is really just like you're building relationships and building trust with writers. You know, the relationship between writers, journalists, and subjects can be really extractive at times on both sides. Journalists can go into communities, take from communities, and then the communities never see them again. But also, like us harassing journalists all the time, that makes them crazy too. So, you know, I would say offering them a little bit of insight. Anytime you want to talk about so-and-so, feel free to call me. That can be valuable. Ray says, basta. Thanks, everyone.
So we have three amazing resilience and heat officers here that are going to share some of their stories, frontline stories, in terms of communicating to various different audiences, things that have worked, things that haven't, and also reflect on what you just heard, what resonates with you. So with that, Marta.
Great. All right. Hi, everyone. Marta Segura, the Chief Heat Officer for the City of Los Angeles and also the Director of the Climate Emergency Mobilization Office. Well, so much resonated from what the Dean said to what Allison said in terms of really knowing your community and who you're speaking to. But when you have a city as metropolitan as the City of Los Angeles with multiple ethnic groups and languages and enclaves, it can get to be really challenging. And this last summer, I think we made a good effort to have our heat relief campaign really speak to the health issues, the safety issues of extreme heat to the community. And we did it in like 7 different languages, maybe 8 actually. And we put it on bus shelters, bus benches, inside the buses themselves. And we basically compensated some CBOs to also distribute the materials. And I think that's a key point. If you want to target specific communities and you're a municipality or a city, you really can't expect to do the work yourself. We have reserved funds at the City of Los Angeles to compensate community-based organizations to help us do that work. And many of them have organizers or community health educators, and we're actually trying to ensure that when we apply for grant funding, we always include a budget for these CBOs and community health educators. But I'll tell you something interesting. Somebody who's heard me speak to the news in English and in Spanish, they told me when you speak in Spanish, you're like speaking from the heart. And you're speaking, I could tell you're speaking to your community the way that you would speak to your parents or to your grandmother or to your aunt. And when you speak in English, you use more technical jargon, you use more academic language, and you really do deliver better in Spanish. So that, I had never paid attention to that, right? But it became really interesting to me that I was a better communicator to these communities in Spanish than I am in English. So then I said, what do? Do I translate it into Spanish and go back into English? No, but anyway, I just, as an aside, when you're speaking from the heart and when you're speaking to somebody that you can visualize that's in your community, like your aunt, your mother, your father, your grandmother, and you can see how this is affecting them directly, I think it makes a big difference on how you deliver. I'll stop right there because there's a lot more to share in terms of cultural competency, linguistic competency, ensuring that you're targeting the movers and shakers in those communities. And in fact, I want to mention that this office, the Climate Emergency Mobilization Office, would not exist if it weren't for CBOs, the environmental justice organizations that advocated for an office that would help transform decision-making for climate justice in the city of Los Angeles. So it was their voices that brought this office into creation. So I'm always thinking of these marginalized frontline communities first and foremost. So I really appreciate this conversation about communications because I want to deliver, not just to deliver information on climate, but to show them how this is relevant to them. And for me, I always come back to health, right? These climate changes, these climate emergencies, these climate hazards affect the health of our communities. And that's a very real, tangible issue that we can see, that we can feel, that hurts our families, our fathers, our mothers, our children, whether it's asthma or whether it's some cancer or another chronic illness. And when we can connect those chronic illnesses to pollution and climate change or the increased mortality during heat events due to these heat waves that are more frequent and of more duration. Not that I want to focus on the negative, but we're talking about what makes this relevant and important to me, and then how can I be a problem solver for that issue that affects my community, that affects my family. So, passing it over.
Thank you. I'm Casey Calloway, and yeah, everyone should carry around an Allison accent because she'll be your best fan girl. She's amazing, and it's so right about where we are and who we are, what we've done. My first 25-ish years has been involved in environmental advocacy. I ran Mobile Baykeeper, part of Waterkeeper Alliance, grew the organization from nothing into a staff of 20 and a pretty hefty budget. And I never, ever, one single time, ever said climate change. Not from a podium, not even really in one-on-one conversation. Did I work on climate change? Every single day. But I did it by trying to stop this pollution source, that pollution source, fix this flooding issue. Everything that we did, everything I did with the organization, with Mobile Baykeeper, absolutely working on climate change, working to stop climate change daily. So when I found out from, I am a fangirl of 10 Across, as y'all learned last year from the podium, but I learned about Chief Resilience Officers here, and when I got engaged in that work, climate is just a part of it. Resilience and climates are so tightly tied together. And so people kind of knew that there was a code that Casey might start talking about climate. And I would get these really funny emails that said, we're so excited about that litter education campaign you're doing. Please do more of that and not that climate stuff. Okay. I have a million of those, y'all, just in case you're curious. So I get to say, we can do two things. We can do litter education and we can talk about climate because, they're actually really closely connected there too. But I also, in this work and just being really thoughtful and careful about it, I wrote some talkers up for the mayor when he gave a presentation at a big environmental business luncheon, and he stands up at that podium and he says climate change 3 different times, and I assure you everybody in that room was like beeline looking at me. It's like, you did this. And I did not write climate change on his talking points, so he just did it. So the thing is it starts to get into people's skin and they start to get there with what you're doing. They start to hear it and they start to feel it, because I think what Allison's point about just keep talking about the issues. You don't have to use this word or that word, but you got to keep talking about the issues and that connectivity. The kind of story I want to also share is there's a knowing your audience, knowing who you're trying to reach, but there's also making sure you've got the right messenger. And I think that's absolutely what she's got up there, just in a little bit of a different language. But there's one major project that I care deeply about. It is a road project on the coast, right there at the river. It is a port project. It is new growth of a major industry. We're deepening and widening the ship channel. We have all sorts of industrial growth that could happen right there. And when it rains, the water stays 2 feet deep for days and days and days. The infrastructure has not been upgraded since possibly the Civil War. So when they had a wooden stormwater pipeline fault cave-in, they just filled it with concrete because that worked. Now, I use that issue particularly, and I've talked about that issue entirely from the perspective of an economic impact problem. So the businesses that are right there are desperate for change. They want to see something happen. But guess who's on the other side of that major industrial section? On the other side of the highway is a community that every time it rains gets flooded with sewage and stormwater. Low income, predominantly African American, families that have been there for generations. So if we fix this problem for my industry guys, and they can talk to the mayor a whole lot easier than the lower income community can, we fix a problem for all the folks upstream. So again, who do I have to get to the audience to talk about it? I need to get these business leaders to say, Mayor, invest here. But I need to also talk about the communities that are surrounding it, who will be impacted when we write the major grant and we get Justice 40 involved in it, and we include all of the different funding mechanisms. Because if you look around just a little bit more broadly, you'll find the people who are all impacted. There is almost always an economic impact, loss, need, gain by doing a better project. But you'll also, 90% of the time, when you're talking about climate, when you're talking about the environment, flooding, water, air, you're also going to find people who are impacted, who need you, who don't have a loud enough voice.
Wow. I should not have sat at the end of this. I've been Aojatayo. I'm an assistant city manager in Tallahassee, but I began my career with the city as their first chief resilience officer. So very much a similar work that led to my role now. I had the privilege of helping the city create their resilience plan, and then they said, okay, do it. And doing it necessarily required marshaling resources across the entire city organization. I shared this with our network earlier today. It's both a blessing and a curse. It's a burden to have to talk about this, but we get to. And when you have the privilege to implement, I think for a lot of cities where the rubber meets the road, that's when you really test these ideas and these stories and bring about reality. I'll share sort of 2 things in line with communicating effectively and getting results. One is finding multiple entry points. And the second is empowering those who are vulnerable and changing that narrative a bit so that it's not so much about talking about vulnerable people, but empowering people to be their own first responders, their own saviors when it comes to this work in community resilience. On finding multiple entry points, I think, for at least for my community and for my work, what has worked really well is to find creative ways to talk about resilience as many different ways as possible to as many different audiences as possible. Like the Bible says, for those who read the Bible, we try to be all things to all men so we can save some. What I found to be a good way to bring about change is to shape the message of resilience to the person. And it's not just about the audience, I'm listening for what is important to them and what is current effort, and I shape my resilience message around that. And so the entry point is really not just a conversation starter, but it's an invitation to them to get into this work. Rather than me looking for ways to make my work make sense to them, I'm looking for ways to take the things that are important to them and reframe it so that they can see that they're actually already working on this. And maybe I can help either elevate their work a little bit more, I can bring attention or resources to it, or I can help them solve a problem. That is my favorite thing to do, to make everything about resilience. It could be about car washes, it could be about daycare, it could be whatever, but that challenge of saying, doesn't matter, whatever is important to you, I can find a way for you to see your work as part of this. And then immediately I'm looking for ways for you to be a champion. Not necessarily for me to champion the cause for you, but for you to champion this. And so that's opened up a lot of doors for us to have a deep integration of sustainability and resilience efforts in our city organization and in our communities, so that effectively I can work myself out of a job. There's still somebody now doing CRO work. I have a colleague here as well from Tallahassee, but I think part of what helped is once you start framing these solutions in different sectors, you get the invitation to solve it. You get the opportunity to work on more things. And the burden is you don't get to stick around too long to do some of the work. You get kind of asked to do other things. But I think that's a really good part about this work. It touches on everybody's work and their lives, and you look for opportunities for them to enter into the work or an invitation through these entry points. Second thing is working with vulnerable populations. And I love what Allison has already shared, and I think a lot of you already know. We know the people that are most vulnerable, that are most impacted. But when we were doing our work in our community, the questions we asked yielded a different way of framing resilience, not just in telling people how they're vulnerable, but how might we help you to help yourself? And it is amazing the level of solutioning and creativity that comes out of asking communities how they want to thrive. They have lots of ideas. They didn't need me to tell them that, right? And so it's shaped how we develop programs, and it shaped the speaker and the champion of it. So it doesn't have to be me. I can go to the neighborhood association president who knows very well what happens in each block of their neighborhood, and they can go tell their own story. So not just talking about the people that are impacted, but having the people that are impacted be the champions and be the voice. A lot of the work we've done around community resilience in Tallahassee is bottom up and preparedness focused. That means when it comes to natural, now you got me checking myself on natural disasters. When we talk about just events and shocks in the community, not only do these neighbors and these residents know it, and they have perhaps their own way of describing the impact to them, but they're able to bring along their neighbors and build capacity. So they're the trainers. They're the ones helping their neighbors to build a kit or to build a preparedness plan. They're teaching each other, and that is incredibly empowering. And once we get through that effort, you can see the excitement to take on even bigger challenges, to do more things. So it is time so well spent to build capacity for vulnerable people to be their own champions, to be their own advocates. And then when they do, give them the credibility and the respect of the work and the thoughts that they're contributing to this work. We'll end there, and I think as we're supposed to govern ourselves accordingly, we want to give an opportunity for folks in the audience to also either ask a question of us and the work we do, or to also share some successes that you found in your own work. Or you can clap for them.
Well, I could give one more. Is there a question?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
Just a quick question. I was actually just talking about this in the crowd. I'm all about resilience planning. I exactly sure what the source of that is, but is that something that you've encountered in your work, and do you have any suggestions?
Yeah, I definitely heard from some of the CBOs that resilience has just too many meanings, and they want to be perceived. Either the question is they want to be perceived as resilient, or they want us to stop expecting them to create their own resilience, right? So definitely have come across that. Although, and it reiterates how important language is. And one way that we've overcome that is by having lots of conversations with the community, listening to them, integrating their language into the work that we do, but also explaining to them that there are certain words that are being used in the EPA or the state that we need to use to apply for grants to demonstrate that we're doing the work that needs to be done for FEMA, et cetera. So there's a conversation happening. They're telling us what they prefer. We're telling them we want to integrate their language, but at the same time, explaining why we need to use those words in the work that we do. But I wanted to give an example that we have these conversations with like last week, we had a planning committee for a community assembly that we're hosting in February. We invited like 30 organizations to be part of the planning committee so that they could tell us what issues they want to discuss with regards to climate or climate justice or public health. And they're shaping the agenda for that community assembly. And they're telling us how they want it delivered. They're telling us that they want to be facilitators and speakers and panelists and what approaches for communication that they want to use for those workshops or for that assembly. And so it's building trust, right? And that's another thing we talked about. They were letting me know, as you know, and of course we all know this, that there's very little trust in government right now. But they were there, they were present, and they were there to tell me and share with me how we should work together and how we should deliver this information to their various communities. So I guess bottom line is try to have more deliberate, intentional conversations with these community leaders that represent your region or your municipality so that they can help you shape your language and also deliver the message.
I want to add one additional thing to that is there's a little bit of a difference between individuals and communities. So a lot of what I hear from the negative on our people are resilient is that government and businesses and everyone else are making the people be resilient in their communities, predominantly, again, low-lying, flood-prone, low-income communities of color. Those guys, we're so proud of them for being resilient, but we're not doing anything because that resilient means they're fine, rather than really taking care of the communities and investing in those communities, particularly in our resilience assessments and planning. So I think that's an additional piece is like our city is not resilient. We're relying on our community, our people to be resilient on their own, and we're not giving them the tools and resources to do that. So I think that's a little of what you might have also been hearing in the community. And I think that like who is supposed to be resilient is a question we always need to be asking. Both of these Wonder Women consistently reminding us to go to the community and let the community tell us what resilience is, what they need to be resilient, as opposed to us, we're the government, we're here to save you and tell you what that's about.
Hi, so I have a question. I'll talk loud. It's really interesting how you meet people where they are and you start talking to them about, the car wash, how it relates to resilience. So I'm wondering, is there another word, is there another way that you talk about it so that you're staying away from the jargon? Here in these policy ranks and the government ranks, it's all about the language, right? I do believe it is about the community, but what are some tips you could give us? What's some better ways we could say? Like, how do you do that magic?
The magic. It's black girl magic. I don't know. It's, I think well, one is to study to show yourself approved. So I don't think we can cheapen this effort by just saying it comes to you. You have to do some homework before you start to engage people so that you have just a modicum of an entry point, right? It is both within our organization. I'm talking with professionals that are experts in their own field, as well as a layperson in the street. So I'll give an example from our IT director. I invited him to go co-present at in an audience that was familiar to him, but a little bit diversified. When I'm talking with him, I'm talking using terms like redundancy and reliability. We're talking about how his network infrastructure can withstand cyber attacks. And I have to know just enough to be dangerous. Don't ask me anything more than that because I'm going to get us in trouble. But when I'm speaking his language, we're talking about a resilient infrastructure, and we're talking about how the work he does supports community resilience and organizational resilience. So that's one way that I have to do enough homework to show up and be prepared. When I'm talking to a neighborhood association, I will need to know a little bit about who they are and not say, for example, when one of our neighborhoods, if you go in and say, I'm here in the Bond neighborhood, this is an actual neighborhood, somebody will quickly correct you and say, well, we're actually, the Villa so-and-so section, because that there is a real solid identity around that, and they're not just part of this greater Bond neighborhood. But honoring that from the front end is sufficient to open the door for more conversation. So how to do that is not a magic phrase that works uniformly in all audiences, but it is showing up with a little bit of awareness about the audience and entering into their world.